beginning of the new age, the United States is at war and it is year 1849. Andrew White, a known Cross and Bones member, pursues in strange and precarious behaviors by first traveling to Europe asking for European support for the Confederate Army. Then when his attempts fail, White returned to the United States, where he then ran for Congress on the Union ticket. Later he was involved in the building of two well-known colleges, Cornell and Syracuse. His partner of course was Cornell, and he was happy with assisting in the building of Syracuse, but was unhappy about the arrangement concerning the name. He wanted Syracuse himself, so White convinced him to build yet another college with him and named it after Cornell. White became president of Cornell, building a mansion of his own on campus, and served as a professor in the history department. After White served as ambassador to Germany, researched the feasibility of the annexation of the Dominican Republic, became prime minister to Russia, served as president of the American Peace Delegate at the Hague for the American Historical Society from 1884 to 1886. At one time, White's library held election protection in the United States. He was obsessed with Reformation, witchcraft and the French Revolution, and collected and ready to find on the subjects. Sent his library curator/manager all over the world in search of such books. His collaborator/manager was named George Lincoln Burr, and his sole responsibility was traveling abroad in search of literature. Later in White's life he would also become obsessed with the Mormon Church as well, which is odd considering his into religion versus science in education. White was the first institute and strongly believed in the study of science without religion, so much that he wrote on the subject, but many believe it was only a ploy to promote his schools and encourage students to attend. This time in history, most schools practice the teaching of liberal arts and religious teaching in colleges. He lectured on the battlefield of science, declaring that only negative outcomes came out of the past. President interference science by religion, which he declared was dogmatic theory. His writing on the subject was a total of 2 volumes, A History of the Warfare of Science and Theology, written in 1896. An older book by John William Draper was written 20 years earlier, named History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science in 1874, creating the debate between evolution and creation. It was thought, though, that these 2 volumes written by White was a ploy, like I mentioned before, because most scholars of White's time found false and untrue among the scientific and the educated community. It was thought that he wrote these volumes to draw attention to himself as well as to Syracuse and Cornell. Considering his extreme obsessions concerning the being a member of a Hermetic organization, and then later the obsession of the Mormon belief, I would to it. When he died, he was buried in a tomb on the campus of Cornell, and on his sarcophagus you could see the symbol St. George. As I look at things written in English, certain things stick out. First, just because something seems to be false doesn't necessarily mean they're false. It's a well-known practice, and it still is, that in order to get people to see something that they would ordinarily look at, feed them misinformation with little gold nuggets that they can find, in order to find the real stories hidden within the false stories. Second, some of things that I read are nothing more than just puzzle pieces. Information for me to find, so I can't figure out the truth as I go along looking for clues to the stories I am reading. Stories of St. George, John Prester and Merlin, both in the King Arthur stories and before he was incorporated into the King Arthur stories. It's said that Jacob and Columbus were fans of John Prester. Merlin speaks for itself. St. George is an old Christian fable that goes all the way back to the Roman Empire, after it converted over to Christianity. Kings and queens use St. George on medals that they give out in highest and noblest esteem in the Holy Roman Empire. Even today, Mess are out soldiers, military name for St. George, and as I mentioned before, it is also a symbol for the Cross and Bones Society. A long time ago, in a village, there was a dragon. This dragon was a menace, causing grief for the villagers by nesting in a spring that provided water for its people who were nearby. In order to dislodge the dragon from the spring, the villagers would first use a sheep as a sacrifice to the mighty beast as a distraction. When the dragon went to devour its sacrifice, the villagers quit their water while the dragon was occupied. As time passed, though, the villagers eventually ran out of sheep. They then choose their maidens from their village as sacrifice to the dragon in place of the sheep they once used and eventually no longer had. The maiden to be sacrificed was chosen by drawing lots. One day, as the maidens drew their lot, the prince was chosen as the next sacrifice. How the monarch begged for the princess to be spared with no avail. The princess is offered, but lo and behold, out of the light appeared the brave and just St. George, who saves the prince by slaying the dragon, releasing the village of its horrible situation and restoring peace once more to the monarch. The British king once wished to build a great tower. He chose to build it upon a foundation that he felt was strong. Each time he attempted to build the tower, though, the ground would rumble and the tower would fall. Quite agitated by this, the king called for wise men and demanded a solution to his problem. The wise men pondered on the issue and eventually came up with a solution. Sir, they pronounced, the foundation of this tower is cursed. It must be blessed with the blood of a fatherless son. Sprinkle it upon the foundation and the tower will not fall. The king exclaimed, "Where can we find such boy?" And one of the wise men responded, "I know of such a boy. His name is Merlin, and his mother gave birth to him without a father." "Bring this boy to me," the king demanded, and his men quickly rode off in search of young Merlin. Finding the young Merlin, the king's soldiers returned to their king by his tower, and present boy as a sacrifice. Being a good king and not wanting to sacrifice Merlin without an explanation, he explains to the boy the situation. He tells of how his men have built the tower and its foundation and how the foundation was cursed. He explained that when men begin to build the tower, a great rumble gathers up from the ground and causes the tower to fall. He then concludes with this being the reason why sacrificing Merlin for his blood was necessary. After hearing the story, young Merlin insists, "Might not help you with this problem." "What do you mean, boy?" the king asked. "That was told me by my wise of wise men." Merlin looked the foundation over and responded once again, "It is not your foundation that is the problem, and it is by means cursed." The king, "If it is not cursed, then what could the problem be?" Merlin then explained, "It is not the foundation, nor is it the tower itself, but it is what is under the foundation that is the problem. Under your foundation is the spring, and in this spring there are two dragons, each dragon more furious than the other. They stay outside, but then they become restless of one another. They fight. That is what causes the rumbling, which causes your foundation to shake and eventually your tower to fall. Stop the dragons from fighting, the tower will no longer fall." Oh, how grand were the adventures of Prester and his journey to far-off mystical lands. Yes, full of adventure, magic and mystery. Legendary treasures, the fountain of youth, the mirror that you can look into and see everyone on the surface of the earth. The more lands that discoverers found, though, this magnificent land changed location. As adventurers explored more territory, the story would grow. These stories shared such people Marco Polo, Columbus, Roger Bacon, and many more. Marco Polo discovered China. Columbus discovered the Americas. Roger Bacon discovered how manipulate so that he could create man-made rainbows. He also labeled black powder, after seeing it used by travelers returning from Asia. The Mongols took over Eastern Europe, which opened more routes into the east, making it easier to travel there. These stories opened up the imagination and allowed our forefathers to think of new land and a new life outside of the constraints of their time. They represented bravery, courage, adventure and exploration. Out of all of this came even more imagination, that eventually spread from the 11th century into the 15th century. From the 15th century into the 20th and 21st century as well. It was said that Francis Bacon was a reincarnate of many people. It was said that he was once in the past life Samuel, the last judge in the Old Testament, Merlin, Roger Bacon and Columbus. He lived in Atlantis, and from what I gather from research into the period and the subject of Atlantis, he wasn't the only one. There were also judges that Atlantis existed. Francis Bacon went as far as to call America the New Atlantis and wrote a book about it. Also understand too, Roger Bacon was a fan of Prester John. The stories of Merlin were also written about 100 years before Roger Bacon's time. Each of these things tell me Francis Bacon was a big fan of Roger Bacon and believed in his ideas and beliefs wholeheartedly. Comparing Roger Bacon to Francis Bacon, I could easily see similarities between the two men. Scientifically, they believed in inductive reasoning. Roger Bacon was actually one of the first scientists to suggest inductive reasoning, and it was a process that was in fact way before its time in Roger Bacon's world. Francis Bacon worshipped inductive reasoning religiously. It's been said too that Roger Bacon was able to create his own microscope, an astrolabe, that could be read on water. He was able to experiment with the colors within light, by light and manipulate it to form rainbows. Some say too that he was also involved in researching the calendar and accurately telling time. That he proposed 365-day year, instead of the 360-day year that was being used in that region during his life. The church only made the change after Roger Bacon's death, so that isn't a fact. Nor is it the fact that he was arrested for his death either. It is of stories that have been handed down generation after generation, that determined he was arrested for scientific research, just as it seemed for Pythagoras and Jesus' existence as well. Books also suggest that he was involved in alchemy, even have forged signatures of his name in them. Those books, though long discredited and found to have never even belonged to Roger Bacon. Books were Opus Minor, Opus Major, Opus Tertium, Opus File, Secretum, Secretorum, Secula Alchemiae, which in turn means natural and natural, the first tincture root and spirit of metals and minerals, or tincture of antimony and Roger Bacon was never credited for the Voynich manuscript either, but his name was also in that manuscript. Rumors also say that he gave a lot to education in Paris, visiting and teaching when he could. Studying Aristotle, optics, astronomy, alchemy and medicine. He was well compared to other scientists of his time, such as Alkindi, Alhazen and Ibn Saul. Roger Bacon was an exhibitionist to those, and if he was imprisoned it is thought that it was a result of him showing off his scientific findings in public. This may have sealed his fate. Even so, to this to how religion has been nothing but science is also nonsense, considering Ibn Saul was also imprisoned for his scientific beliefs and not by anyone being imprisoned is actually where Ibn Saul made his greatest scientific discovery too. 200 years after Roger Bacon's life, the Voynich manuscript was discovered. It bared his name in it, but as I mentioned before, it was found not to be his signature. The manuscript was discovered near Rome. When analyzed, was discovered that the book's origins were from northern Italy. As scientists began to look at the manuscript, They soon figured out that they had found the best coded manuscript that was ever discovered. During the time which the scientific community have had the Voynich manuscript, military code breakers, as well as the best technologies available, the scientific community have yet been able to decipher the one page. Members of the Central Agent's Office use the Voynich codes as an exercise to see if they could break the codes. They too were left with no results. Some have suggested a link between manuscript, Roger Bacon and John Dee. John Dee was alive during the time that Francis Bacon was alive, so there could be a connection. Considering that Voynich manuscript and John Dee both were attempting to create a language that others were unable to understand, different, or anything else. The few things that can be understood in the manuscripts are images of plants, women dancing together half-naked and holding hands. Some have even suggested that the creator of the manuscript had even possessed telescopes as well as microscopes, because of the images within the pages. They bear a close resemblance to shapes in space that couldn't been seen by the naked eye. Some shapes also resemble bells, but also couldn't be seen by the eye as well. Besides being originated from multiple amounts of people, it was believed that Francis Bacon was a man of a secret society called the Rosicrucians. There is also the Baconian theory of Shakespeare's authorship too. This was interesting to say the least, but I also have to say it holds much weight with the evidence that has been presented since his life and well beyond his death. For years now, from 1600s until now, we have proclaimed that Shakespeare wrote the most elegant, grandest of writings of all writings. But did he? During the time of Shakespeare and well after, there have been and there still are very credible critics who believe that Shakespeare never wrote Shakespeare. Furthermore, it even goes further to say that great Shakespeare never even existed. These people are termed as Baconians. Baconians believe that Shakespeare was actually Francis Bacon, using Shakespeare as a pen name. Turning the meaning of Shakespeare to the goddess Athena from Greek mythology, wearing her helmet of invisibility and holding her spear, with the snake of ignorance at her feet. She would shake the spear at the snake of ignorance and use helmet of invisibility to hide herself. There are other suspects too, implicated in theory as being the actual author of the writings. Some have been said to have done all of it themselves, while others claim a group of writers were responsible for these great feats of literature laid at our feet. Claims that were made about this theory makes a lot of sense, though, if looked at honestly, it should into question the true authorship of the Shakespeare writings. Mark Twain did this. Shakespeare was credited as being the greatest writer of all time and placed on a pedestal where he is actually adored for his writings. He contributed so much to modern English writing, and our children are off to school and taught the teaching of the great man. To die, though, Shakespeare gave one manuscript, one book, for any writings, any kind, and his relatives. During Shakespeare's life, he never received one letter from one single person, not even fan. Not only did he never receive a letter, Shakespeare never sent one either. A man with that much prestige and yet not one letter sent or received. Furthermore, within the Shakespeare family he was only one who could read and write. To this day even Shakespearean supporters admit that he only has 7th grade education. Shakespeare, according to popular folklore, was taken out of school in the 7th grade because of religious differences in England and the Catholic Church during his youth. His father was a devout Catholic, and England previously expelled the Catholic from England and from the Church of England. In response, the Catholic Church told the followers in England that it was a sin to allow their children to go to an Orthodox school, and if they did allow it, English Catholics were sinning against God and the Church. So a lot of Catholic children without education in England during Shakespeare's youth. After leaving school, Shakespeare learning the family trade of glove-making and helping his father in with wool. Other than that, there was no evidence of any opportunities for him to develop his writing skills in which he was credited. Still, he appeared in England. He began writing these grand plays with such knowledge of the world. Even though there are no records of Shakespeare ever traveling anywhere, no ledgers or ship manifests showing that he was on a ship. Not even a letter found saying, "Hey, you wouldn't guess who was on the ship with us." He knew details of France and other countries that he had never traveled to before. He wrote about the law, yet a man of his class ability during the time would know nothing about the law, nor have access to such information. He could cite the law nevertheless. Not one record was ever found that Shakespeare was a lawyer or that he ever held the position involved with law. To the eye of Shakespeare and Bacon was one and the same. I cannot conceive. If you were to put both men's life achievements side by side, you could see clearly that one person could not do all of what these two men had achieved in their life. It was always suspected, too, that one man was possibly Shakespeare, though two, besides Francis Bacon. His name was Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe and Francis Bacon also ran in the same circles. Marlowe was friends with Thomas Walsingham, Francis Walsingham, unknown operative of Queen Elizabeth, in concerns regarding marriage. During Bacon's time, his mentor Amyas Paulet, an operative for England as well in France. Marlowe was in France to his then employer and friend, Thomas Walsingham. Francis Bacon was occasionally known for delivering diplomatic letters to England from France for Francis Walsingham during this time. Soon after returning from France, Christopher Marlowe was arrested by the police, and when released, he was killed short after by Ingram Fraser, supposedly in a drunken fight. Ingram was a servant of Thomas Walsingham, courtier of Queen Elizabeth and related to Francis Walsingham, Queen Elizabeth's master. It was the Renaissance, though a revolution was in the air. Who knows what happened? Many things come to mind, though. It is hard to overlook that these two men contributed too much to be one and the same. I would suspect that Shakespeare was actually just a name. There would have been more than one writer involved. Looking at it in that perspective, I could see some different avenues on what was taking place. During the time Shakespeare was becoming more and more popular, there was a literature society known as the Universities, who were always eager to criticize Shakespeare with every chance they got. Even though they criticized Shakespeare, they were also known to have collaborated with him, worked with him, starred in Shakespeare's plays, and even became partners with him in theaters that they would purchase together. Odd behavior in my humble opinion. Speaking of literature societies, let's not forget that Bacon did indeed have his own group of writers, who he would have worked there with Onyx and Co. too. The Tudor theory concerning Francis Bacon believed the Francis Bacon was a legitimate child of Queen Elizabeth. The theory claims that Queen Elizabeth hid pregnancy and birth so that she could still a nobility of Gen Queen. The theory also adds that Bacon's father was a man who married Queen Elizabeth in secrecy. In the 1920s, an American physician named Lord Warren claimed to have hidden ciphers within the Shakespeare writings. Using a cipher wheel, he embodied words or phrases from Francis Bacon, Shakespeare, and other writers to the cipher wheel and claimed to have messed in Shakespeare/Bacon writings. The 1,000-word strip of words and phrases were applied to cans and rolled on the wheel included words and phrases from Christopher Marlowe as well. Key words and phrases were then highlighted. The findings were checked by cryptologists William and Elizabeth Friedman, who at first believed theory wholeheartedly but eventually concluded that the theory was invalid. Not only did Orville Ward Odenfield Bacon wrote Shakespeare, he believed that Bacon also wrote all of Robert Greene, George Peele's, Edmund Spenser's and Robert Burns' writings as well. Later, Orville Ward Owen was to write a book called Sir Francis Bacon's Cipher Story, which in turn gave birth to the Prince Tudor theory. In the story, Sir Francis Bacon was actually the son of Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley Earl of Leicester, who also had another son, Robert Devereux, second of his six, who Elizabeth later executed because of an attempted rebellion against England. According to the theory, Bacon wrote hidden stories of this in his writings under his hand names so that it wasn't directly connected to them. Orville Ward also claimed not only were they put into the stories, but they were written as ciphers, hidden from few those who make sense of books. To date has been found any of the writings discussed this, but questions of Shakespeare's writings have been brought into question since, and apparently before this theory it was in question as well. His belief in this eventually drove Ward to England, where he began to excavate the rivers of the River Wye in England, believing there with answers who were hidden in the form of missing manuscripts. The original manuscripts of Shakespeare's original early play none was found. Warren died bedridden, poor and discredited because of this belief, and recognized before his death that nobody should ever become interested in this subject whatsoever. Shortly after his death, Owen's assistant, Elizabeth Wells Gallup, developed his thesis, and his cipher was owned as well by Virginia Fellows in a Detroit warehouse, who eventually the Shakespeare Code, which was published in 2006 after her death. In his youth, Bacon was shipped to France and put under the tutelage of Amyas Paulet, where he learned about culture, law, politics, and developed as a gentleman and a scholar. He also learned early techniques of espionage that was in hand with his mentor, who was supposed ambassador to Paris, was in fact a spy working for England. Lee said, though, concerning Francis Bacon being the son of Queen Elizabeth, and not only thought to have been the illegitimate son either. Another man by the name of D was also suspected of being the son as well. During this period in history, both would not expect to find much information on the topic, considering most who did know anything would have stayed silent for fear of their lives. I personally believe that there is a conspiracy that Shakespeare is not Shakespeare. It was actually a 17th century that worked homosexual behavior. Even if it was true that Shakespeare was a just pen name, or more than one person was involved, a lot of evidence convinced me that this was so. When Bacon lost his standing in the English courts and Parliament for taking bribes, he was arrested and later released after declaring his crimes. It was said, but it never made a fact, that if he did declare his crimes of bribery, he would have been charged with burglary, a term closely related to the charge of assault used against people caught in the act of homosexual behavior. Francis Bacon's sexuality was brought into question by scholars as well. Him and King James both preferred what was termed as masculine love. King James and Bacon at first did not see eye to eye on certain things, but eventually the king accepted Bacon into his court. King James was also known to frequent plays written by Shakespeare. When Gaul opened up routes to the east by taking land in Eastern Europe, it opened an avenue to most Europeans of adventure, fascination, and a desire to learn things which most Europeans never knew. Since the beginning of known history, has always had the ability to harness light. Roger Bacon was a good example of that. The Mongols, unknowingly, also contributed to the advancement of science as well. New trips by sea and by land opened up new territories, both to the east and to the west of Europe. Columbus discovered America, and Francis Bacon was so excited he wrote a book, claiming that it was the New West. Lee discovered Florida and searched for fountain of youth for the remainder of his life. The story heard from the adventures of John. In the same century that Roger Bacon was alive, the secret society of the Rosicrucians was formed, which later formed into the same ideas adopted by the Freemasons of later centuries to come. Not only was it the time of the Renaissance and the time of revolution, it was also the time of birth of the Gimmicks. The 1600s were a very important time in our history. Francis Bacon, his belief of reincarnation and his admiration for people such as Roger Bacon and Columbus created a future that we see and experience to this day. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, debate over the Middle Ages have been discussed by scientists with the concern on whether science actually flourished or not. Pierre Dut wrote a book called The History of Science, fostering the idea that the Church actually contributed to the advancement. Also there were others that insisted that the Church was a hindrance to science. Old ideas of inductive reasoning seem to be an issue among these debates, in my opinion. Most of what science is today isn't really tested with inductive reasoning, which means experimentation. During the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, it was a major of science. The Church during the Middle Ages and even before the Middle Ages didn't agree with ideas of experimentation by dissection. It was thought to be evil and a form of devil worship. In Alexandria, a scientist named Hypatia, one of the first contributors to the invention of the accolade, was accused of being a witch. Hypatia was dragged into the streets, mumbled and then burned at the stake. Alexandria at that time condoned dissecting the bodies of their dead for the sake of science. For some reason, the accolade was related to as being a form of witchcraft. Christians soon after decorated the temples, magics that represented Egyptian gods and replacing them with Christian symbols. As time went by, Christianity went from worshipping God that was love, understanding peace, to a God that hated pagans and heretics and punishing them for their beliefs. Thus, as time went by, secret societies were formed and flourished throughout Europe. Practicing alchemy, astrology and hermetics without the threat of danger. Peter Grimus, though, during the 13th century, started with magnetism, which in turn used to improve the astrolabe, creating a universal astrolabe, making it easier for maritime sailors to navigate on water. He was also known for his work on freely pivoting compass needles, which made it easier to navigate with dry compasses. Peter was the first scientist who also believed in perpetual motion, which could also be referred to today as free energy. Esoteric belief is what forms the basic ideas and concepts of the Hermetics. It's not quite clear either on the date of when the Rosicrucian Society first formed. It is said, though, that the original membership was always kept to a small number and members had to have backgrounds in medicine. It is believed, though, that it began to form in the 15th century, the same in which the manuscript was written. Who say that these earlier members of the society didn't have access to microscopes and telescopes. It was said that they were invented. Columbus himself read and studied Ptolemy, and many of the people of that time period also studied there. We know that much of what was written concerning history has been distorted. I wrote about Shakespeare and the theory about him, even though it is not a fact. History, not one time was the theory even brought to my attention until later in my life. I also went to research and find it myself. With this in mind, understand too, we send our children to school and college to learn about Shakespeare. Not anything about subject that ancient, though, has ever been introduced to the or added to any curriculum to know the entire subject and both sides of it. They are great material that have questioned not by judged people, but also by known individuals in the writing field itself. It is the same with concern to Columbus as well. Our students told that discover America, yet information is held back concerning the fact that he was also held in Spain on charges of genocide tyranny while he governed the same land he discovered. Also a well-known fact too, Columbus, as he grew old, became religious and his thoughts were apocalyptic. His idea of sailing west was from a book he had called the Second Book of Esdras, which claimed that the world was made up of 6 parts of land to 1 part water. This can also be used as a example, again the idea that Shakespeare ever wrote. Both men came from low stature. Columbus, though, traveled from ice to Africa and abroad until he finally reached America. These voyages allowed him to learn astrology, astronomy, theology and more. Not one time was his journeys not documented in ledgers and ship manifests. Documentation that each maritime sailor had to sign in order to work on ships that they sailed on, or passengers signed in order to be guests on that ship as it sailed. The church during the Middle Ages and even before the Middle Ages didn't agree with ideas involving experimentation by definition. It was to be evil and a form of devil worship. In Alexandria, a scientist named Hypatia, one of the first contributors to the invention of the accolade, was accused of being a witch. Hypatia was dragged into the streets. She was dismembered and burned at the stake. Alexandria at that time condoned dissecting the bodies of their dead for the sake of science. For some reason, the accolade was related to as being a form of witchcraft. Christians soon after desecrated the Temple of Luxor, removing objects that represent Egyptian gods and replacing them with Christian symbols. As time went by, Christianity went from worshiping God that was love, understanding and peace, to a God that hunted down witches, pagans and heretics and punishing them for their beliefs. Thus, as time went by, secret cities were formed and they flourished throughout Europe. Practicing alchemists, astrologers, and hermetic believers could work without the threat danger. The law about SecretSocieties during the Renaissance and Middle Ages have been widely considered myth and folklore, figments of the imagination, thought up by crazy conspirators and madmen. The truth, though, is quite the opposite. Even when certain individuals concede to the idea that they did exist, the belief truly that they only consist of groups hiding from the public in fear of death by the hands of the church. To some extent this is true, but Hermetic Society were not the only secret societies in Europe, much less the world. The Catholic Roman Empire itself's own system, and in this system there were many societies of secrecy, filled with knights and citizens of nobility, with their own set of laws and oaths in which to live by. Germany practiced law with Gimmicks courts, which also were the of secrecy as well. They were full of secret tribunals which criminals with the term reprobates. Shakespeare's to be or not to be uses rabbinic oath of depiction also. As a result to disputes between war actions of the time, many criminals would travel, fleeing from the mandates of the law that they were deemed criminals to. They would go to areas in Europe that were not ruled by the states that wanted them for the crimes they committed. Thorndike described very well the process of how Middle Age Germany practiced Gimmicks law. The Gimmicks tribunals worked in secrecy, and if any outsider found out about it, the sentence was death. The sentence for any crime in Gimmicks law was actually death. The members were given passwords, secret handshakes, and signs, so that members would know they were a member of the society. The practice of Gimmicks law was vital to Germany during the 14th and 15th century due to the fact that the emperor had no other solutions available for justice at the time. It flourished for well over 400 years, until eventually, like every bit of justice, it became coated with complaints from the people concerning the corruption, pandemic laws were used to handle criminals who ill with graft, murder, rape, and robbery. If 3 or more members caught a criminal in the act, the sentence was automatic. To summons a criminal to court, members would post the summons to a tree or some place where the accused would find it anonymously. To be rid of the charges against them, criminals would have to appear for trial and cleared both. If they were members, they could appear in court and do it themselves, but if they weren't a member, they would need to be represented by a family member was the member of the demic courts and still had to be cleared by a process. If that wasn't possible, then 23 members of the court had to give their oaths in favor of the accused. In order for that individual to be cleared of the charges again. If found guilty, the accused was immediately hung by the neck at the nearest trees, and a mark engraved into the tree as well saying, SSGG, showing that the game had done its work. Clint Thorndike was an excellent writer, and I would suggest reading his work about the Middle Ages, especially a book entitled History of Math and Experimental Science. Hopefully if God sees it, Saint Michael, wherever he may be, protector and healer, will someday do what has foretold Ephesus. Someday the temples of full Christians, with demon sculptures used only to scare the people, will be crushed beneath us. Do we really need to use unjust methods to persuade us our ways? Someday the false prophet will be defeated by this mighty archangel who never seemed to be there before in times of strife. Coming down in the last days, crushing the humorous arrow of his false teachings. Teach that replace many religions with only one message that God is actually devil and we are merely aliens left behind. This great brotherhood of nothing that leads to nothing but supposedly is religious dogma, yet means nothing in reality. Our history is being distorted by teachers who decide what is seen and what's behind. To our people feel they have the right to decide what I should and what I shouldn't know. And there is Saint Michael, the one Daniel foresaw in a dream, the protector. Where is that protection that the angels were supposed to give? Is it only for Jews and not for the Gentiles? No, the Jews feared more than us. Maybe he will crush a false idol planted on the fountains of our capitals, disguised as justice and freedom for all who shall know the lies of our forefathers and denial of it. Hidden on the buildings in plain sight for ignorantly and still they out. We march for a meaning that is hidden, and we say that we do it for a God that nobody on this planet seems to believe in anymore. When we say these things, we are scorned for what we say, and it's true now, just as it was in the days of prophet Amos out of Israel. In the last days, hopefully Saint Michael will appear to defeat the devil once and for all. Not what we have made, science will someday explain that as well. Is the docile archangel, the seducer and destroyer, both good and evil? How many heavens are there? 7, 5, or just 6? Is there really 5 levels of the world as the Hasidic Jews would suggest? Is the ladder that sailed travel Saint Michael made to the same ladder that was to enter Th, murdered by his brother resurrected Isis? Just maybe, mixing the beliefs of the with and Judaism created something new. Maybe King James Version Bible was created by something new as well. Will we ever know? Kabbalah, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, such theosophical beliefs seem in the future. Maybe even replaced eventually by science itself. What did our forefathers really know? What did they do? Bankers and religion lost and then found again, it seems. Through legends and societies we think of in fantasy, and facts throughout history. Evidence proved then mentioned, making the pearl the crackpot. Hidden truth, feeded by ignorance. Fighters, Crusades, bankers of time, betrayed by the nations they gave allegiance to, casted out or killed. Hotels of all time, the cathedrals of Europe, with their demons standing guard and windows filled with stories of creation. Geometry that only the holy knew, the Temple of Windsor. It was all Christian, of course. Again we hear of initiations to enter their fold,